In this video, we're going to take our first look at the Java collections framework. Specifically, we're going to use the array list. There are a number of advantages to using containers from the Java collections framework. Reduces programming effort because you don't have to write as much code. There's many behaviors built in already. Increases performance because the built-in behaviors are highly optimized. Provides interoperability because everyone's doing everything the same way instead of writing their own solutions for things. So software solutions are more easily reused. To use an array list, we'll look at several things. First, we look at creating an array list and have here a framework for a demo program. We'll compile as ArrayList demo Java. Demonstrate the ArrayList container. Now, it is part of the Java util library, so that does need to be imported. So to create an array, use keyword ArrayList, then angle brackets, because you have to say what type of data you're going to use the ArrayList to store. All right, and here we'll use integer, because we have to use the reference types, which for the int is capital I, right, spelled out completely. And we'll call this list of integers. Right. So that's setting up the name we'll use for the array list. To create the storage and attach it to the name, use the keyword new, and then array list again with empty angle brackets and empty parentheses. Right, so this empty angle brackets there is called the diamond operator, and that's instructing Java to use whatever type is supplied here. So we don't have to repeat it. And notice that there is no mention anywhere of a size. So as a key advantage of using an array list is that you don't have to know the size up front. Right, so what goes in the angle brackets, right, depends on what you're trying to store. Right, so for a list of doubles, I would use double in the angle brackets, also capitalized because we have to use a reference type. Right, and then of course, descriptive name, but then the right-hand side is the same, right, because we're not mentioning the type again. Right, looks very similar. We can then likewise create a list of strings by using string in here. And we see string is already capitalized because it is a reference type. Right, so that's creating array list. We now have 3 different containers, one for whole numbers, one for floating point values, and one for text data. The next thing we want to be able to do, right, is add elements to these containers. So a number of ways to add things to a container. You can add things just literally. Okay, I can say list of integers dot add. And just put the value that I want to add to the end of the list. So this is different from primitive arrays, right? Because we're using a method. Right? So the syntax here is the name of the container, list of integers, followed by a dot and a method name. Right? So dot add is the add method, right? And you provide the thing that you're adding. So for a couple more examples, so we see here adding 4 items. Right? And each add call puts that value onto the end of the list. So we can add 4 things without ever having had to say that when we created the array. It's very useful to be able to see what your containers hold. Right? And the array lists, all the JCF containers, make it very easy to print directly in a print statement. So what we see here is that an array, unlike a primitive array, an array list, any JCF container, can be used directly as an argument to a print function, and you'll see the contents without having to write a separate loop. Let's take a look at that. So, list of integers, and there they are. And you see they're in the order that they were added. There's other ways to add things to a container. For example, we may have to get values from the user. All right, so here I have a number of values that I want to retrieve from the user, and I'm going to put these into the second array here, the list of doubles. So since we're doing interactive input here, I'm going to tell the user what I want, then read the value, and here now I'm using the add method with a variable. And because I'm using a tokenizing method here, I have to clear the trailing new line when I'm done with that, and then we'll see the inputs back in the terminal. So let's take a look at that. So there's the list of integers. Now I'm in this loop. Enter floating point value number v plus 1, value or number 1, v is 0. And let's say it's 8.7, 9.3, and 2.5. Okay, and there's my list of doubles in the order that I entered them. This requires, of course, knowing how many values there are up front. A nice advantage of using an array list is that you don't have to know that. So consider this next example. We just collect strings from the user and add them to the third list that we created in the beginning, the list of strings. All right, here, we're going to ask the user for an initial input. And if that input is greater than 0, has length greater than 0, in other words, if the user types anything, we're going to add that input to the list and then get another one. That's the end of the loop. So as soon as we execute this line here, control will pass back up to the condition, and if that next input has length greater than 0, add that to the list, and then get another one. So this will continue until the length of the input entered is 0. When the length is 0, then the loop will end, and we'll see what was entered. We can make the input have length 0 by pressing enter without typing anything. So let's see how that works. So we go through the floating point values first. Okay, so now we're in this enter a string. Enter a string, blank line to stop. This is our first string. Now, that string had length greater than 0, so we added that to the list, and now we're here. We're getting another string. We're printed this, and now we're on this line, waiting for us. Blue, green. And finally, when you reach the end of your list, I can just press enter by itself, and that stops this loop, and we print the list of strings. Another thing we might want to be able to do with contents of an array list, is find the size. So because the size is variable, it's not specified in the beginning, and you can have an indefinite loop to populate a list. Sometimes it's handy to know how many elements you have. For that, we use the size method. So that's used with the name of the array, followed by dot and the size method. The size method takes no arguments, that's why the parentheses are empty. So in first line, we just embed it directly with using a print line. In the other two examples, I take the value and it substitutes in a formatted print statement. So let's take a look at that. And we have our floating point values. I'm going to here. And now enter a string, blank line to stop. And there they are in the order entered. And now we see the elements. Okay, so list of integers, right, has 4 elements because I used the add statement 4 times. List of doubles, right, has 3 elements because we used a loop that executed 3 times. So we added 3 times. The list of strings, that was an indefinite loop. It just kept going until I entered a blank. Well, that ended up being 5 elements. Notice the blank is not included. A common thing you might also need to do with an array list is get the elements individually. Enhanced for loops are commonly used with all kinds of containers, especially array lists. Right? So suppose we want to add up the elements. Right? So we have some variable here initialized to 0, and the enhanced for loop, right, you declare a variable that will take on each element of the collection on the right side of the colon. All right, so now I can add up all the values from a list of integers and then say what that sum is. String, red, green, blue. Sum of the list of integers, there's the output there, is 20. 4 plus 17 is 21, minus 3 is 18, plus 2 is 20. So you can process the individual elements, right, with an enhanced for loop. Sometimes you need to get the individual values using an index. That's possible too. So in this second example, right, we're using the .get method here. Right? So the name of an array, right, followed by .get with an argument, with an index position as an argument, will retrieve a specific element from the list. All right, so this is very much like how you would use an index for a primitive array. Right, we're using the loop variable, right, in combination now with the get method to retrieve a specific element. So let's see how that looks. And there's the output. So when index, right, was 0, get sub 0 gave us the first number that I input, which was the 9.7. Index went to 1, get 1, retrieved the second number that I entered, and then get 2 gave us the last number that I entered. So you see the get method works very much like square brackets on primitive arrays. So that's a brief introduction to using array lists. In the next video, we'll show how to change elements in an array list.